you'll hear gonna in conversations, but you won't see it in written English. And then Joe goes on to say, you just hope that you're not going to be here for the big one, you know? The big one, what he's talking about is you hope that you're not going to be here or around for a really big earthquake that might hurt or kill a lot of people. And then I laugh and say, yeah, right. So I'm saying, yeah, I know, or I'm just agreeing with Joe. And Joe says, when I first moved here, it was about 5 years after the Loma Prieta earthquake. Loma Prieta, this is the name of a mountain where this earthquake he's talking about that happened 5 years before he moved to San Francisco, the Loma Prieta mountain was at the epicenter or the middle of the earthquake. So he says, yeah, about 5 years after the Loma Prieta earthquake, which is a very big earthquake here, and there are a lot of people who lived here who I met who had actually been living in the area when the earthquake hit or when the earthquake happened. So it was interesting to get their perspective. Perspective, what Joe is saying here is what someone thinks about something. Perspective. An example of perspective is, I like to speak with my mother when I have a problem. She always has a different perspective than me. Perspective. And then I say, oh. And oh here is really just filler. It has no meaning. I didn't even have to say that, but I just say it. Oh. And then Joe says, and it also made me remember where I was when I heard about the Loma Prieta earthquake. I was watching the World Series on TV. World Series, this is the championship games in American baseball. World Series. For example, Joe really likes baseball. One year he went to the World Series even though the tickets were expensive. World Series. And Joe goes on to say, and, it was taking place in San Francisco. Taking place, this means happening. Happening in San Francisco. Taking place. For example, I remember the Winter Olympics taking place in Japan when I was younger. Taking place. And then Joe says, so as I'm watching it, suddenly the announcer starts saying, wow. Announcer, this is a person who talks throughout a sports game about what's happening. Wow. This is just showing emotions such as, I don't believe it. Joe goes on to say, I think we're feeling an earthquake here. And the cameras started shaking, the TV cameras. And Joe goes on to say, and all of a sudden the TV coverage of the game cut out. Now, cut out. Here, cut out means no longer was able to be seen. The TV coverage of the game cut out. It was no longer able to be seen. For example, the television station cut out during the big rainstorm. Cut out. And then Joe says, so, I wanted to get a rundown on what happened. Rundown. This is information. He wanted to get information on what happened. Rundown. An example of rundown would be, I called my mother to get a rundown on how my father was doing. Rundown. And Joe goes on to say, so I turned to the news station, or I changed to the news station. And within a few minutes, few meaning 3 or more, they were discussing or talking. They were discussing this gigantic earthquake that had hit San Francisco. And they started showing pictures, maybe 30 minutes later, of these people who were trying to weed through the rubble of these buildings that had been, coming down. weed through. This means to look or dig through. Weed through. An example of weed through is, I had to weed through a lot of papers when I did my yearly income taxes for the government. Weed through. So he's saying there were people trying to weed through the rubble of these buildings. Rubble means parts, the parts of these buildings that had been like coming down or falling down. And Joe says, so, I mean, it was, and I say, oh, wow. And Joe says, it was pretty scary. Pretty means very here. And Joe says, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what. That means that is for sure. I'll tell you what. An example of I'll tell you what in this situation would be, I'll tell you what, I really enjoyed the Thai food we had today. I'll tell you what. And I say, yeah. And Joe says, you know? And then I say, yeah, well, you know, the 3 months I was living in Japan, I experienced two. Both of those were very different from the one I'd experienced here, and also very different from the one in Bangkok. But one of them, is just short for them. This is something that you'll hear in conversational English, but not see it in written English. So I say, but one of them, I was actually up in my apartment, which was on the 5th floor of a building, and I was woken up at about 5 o'clock in the morning to the building swaying. Swaying means moving from one side to the other side. And I go on to say, and because earthquakes are like a dime a dozen in Japan. A dime a dozen. This means very common. A dime a dozen. An example of a dime a dozen would be, I remember when no one had a cell phone, but today they are a dime a dozen. A dime a dozen. And then I say, they've built a lot of their buildings to absorb the shock. So what I'm saying here, to absorb the shock, means the buildings take the shaking from an earthquake much easier. They make their buildings to take the shaking from an earthquake easier, absorb the shock. And then I say, so that's why it was swaying. It was a very surreal feel. Surreal, this means unreal. Surreal. For example, I looked at the sky and it was purple. It looked surreal. Okay, so that is the end of the conversation. And this is the end of the vocabulary lesson for the conversation. The conversation, earthquakes. So if you need to, go back and listen to this until you have a basic understanding of the vocabulary. And when you feel ready, go to the mini story. All right. Bye-bye. See you next time.